Right. Okay, with the beginning of Chumash Vayikra, and of course, the big question when one starts Chumash Vayikra is the understanding of the purpose of Korbanos. Now, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim suggests something that startled, I guess, many of the commentaries. And the Rambam says, and he himself says that when he first thought of it, he immediately rejected this idea. But then after contemplation, he felt that this had a foundation in the Torah. The Rambam says that man cannot go psychologically, cannot go from one extreme to another. When a person changes little by little, and he says because people were accustomed to Korbanos, to giving sacrifices. Mainly, people gave sacrifices to the Avodah Zarah, to idolatry. Because of that, in a sense, they had a drive for giving of Korbanos. And had the Torah not provided for Korbanos, then there was the possibility and the likelihood that many Jewish people, because of the drive that they had, because of their previous association with Avodah Zarah, with idolatry, that they would go back to worshiping idols. So because of that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu provided them with the mitzvah of Korbanos, which enabled, in a sense, to use the former drive that they had, that they developed from the Avodah Zarah, from idolatry, and to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu instead. Now, this is what the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim says, and the Ramban and many of the other Mefarshim are very much troubled by the Rambam, and they say, we see in the Torah that Cain and Hevel gave Korbanos. I guess the question is more from Hevel than from Cain. And the Medrash says that Adam Rishon gave Korbanos, and the Yavos gave Korbanos. So, according to the Rambam, that the whole purpose of Korbanos, in a sense, is to wean them from Avodah Zarah, from idolatry. So then the question is, certainly that was not a problem with Cain and Hevel. Cain and Hevel predate idolatry. That certainly isn't an issue. And according to Medrash, certainly not an issue with Adam Rishon. And it shouldn't be an issue, of course, but certainly Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they were on a level that they didn't have to worry that they will be attracted to idolatry because of the drive of Korbanos. So how can we explain that according to the Rambam, the purpose of Korbanos was to the Torah making Korbanos a mitzvah, was to wean them from the Avodah Zarah and to use that practice to be closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And the Rambam, of course, explains that tefillah, davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Torah, those are learning Torah, those are aspects, those are forms of service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rambam says on a higher level than Korbanos, than sacrifices. And the only reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu established Korbanos as a form of service was in order to wean them from idolatry. Now, we could suggest, but this would only be a half answer, that now the Rambam, in stressing his point that man was not ready, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in a sense, recognizing the psychology of man, the tendency of man, the tendency of the Jew, gave commandments based on those tendencies. And he gives us an example that when the Jews left Egypt, so there was a longer route to Eretz Yisrael and a shorter route. But if the shorter route was through Eretz Plishtim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, take the longer route. Because when the Jewish people who just came out of Egypt, who are not accustomed to warfare, will see the Plishtim coming out against them, they will immediately return to Egypt. And the Rambam gives this as an example in regard to Korbanos as well. In other words, it was God's knowledge of the psychology of the Jew after his being involved with idolatry in Egypt and maybe from generations before, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu found it necessary to form Korbanos in a manner that will wean them from Avodah Zarah. In other places in Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam points out that the animals that were used for Korbanos, for the most part, were animals that were worshipped by other people. So tzon was worshipped in Egypt. Bakar, the cattle, was worshipped in India. So the in a sense, to use this tendency or the drive for Korbanos to negate the avodah, to negate the avodah zaras that were popular at that time. And we see actually the very fact that the Erev Rav, the Rambam doesn't mention it, but the Erev Rav instigated the Jewish people to make an Egel Hazav. That was indicative of cow worship. We know the Korban Pesach is the lamb, because the Egyptians they worship the lambs. So the din of Korbanos, it seems from the Rambam, was because, on one hand, because of the drive of the Jewish people to make sacrifices with fire. He mentions fire, and on the other hand, it was used as a negation. It was used as a negation of Korbanos. Now, the Now, now we could suggest just that according to the Rambam, perhaps that man progress, that just like man has to, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu formulated his commandments in a manner that dealt with the psychology of man, as we saw in regard to the Jewish people when they went out of the land of Egypt. They could not go Derech Eretz Plishtim, they could not go by way the land of Plishtim, because psychologically they would feel compelled to go back to Egypt. So, and the same thing the Rambam points out is by Korbanos, because the person can go from one extreme, the extreme in Egypt where they were all made of Avodah Zarah, as Uzas, the angel of the Egyptians says, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah, Bahalalu of the Avodah Zarah. The Jewish people in Egypt also worshipped idols. So because of that, God felt it means that they probably gave sacrifices to the idols as well. And it's more than that. Very often, a person who's oppressed, the Rambam doesn't mention this, but a person who is oppressed and who is enslaved by his masters, sometimes in certain aspects, when he becomes free, and sometimes even before he comes free, he imitates his master or his former masters. So there was this danger, this psychological danger of the Jewish people. But we could suggest that this idea that man has to transform himself psychologically from his tendencies doesn't only apply where he has to change, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted man. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not interfere. We see from Parshas B'Shalach, he did not interfere with the tendencies of man. He perhaps helped man, but man had to change his own tendencies himself. And to a certain degree, we could say that's part of the Bechira Chavshis, the freedom of will. But man perhaps had to help formulate from the very beginning his psychology. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man for man to progress. And that would require initially man in the time of Adam Arishon, in the time of Cain v'Hevel. Man understood the idea of coming closer to God, of thanking God, of recognizing that which he has comes from God. And perhaps even some say this was true about Cain, giving to God in order to get from God. Man had to go through various stages. Psychologically, and sure, tefillah, davening, is a higher level of service to God. But in order to understand, in order to feel the closeness to God, in order to feel that he had a strong connection to God, initially, man had to give Korbanos. But man had the ability to progress from that point onward. But unfortunately, man not only didn't progress from that point, but he actually used that eventually for idolatry. So we could suggest certainly through up to the time of Noach, and we see the Torah by telling the korban, by giving the korbanos by requiring the korbanos to be given to the requiring the korbanos to be given to Noach, because he had to give he was told to bring more animals that were kosher than were not kosher, obviously so they should be korbanos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at that point, man did not progress beyond the point yet where tefillah, where davening would be that davening alone would be sufficient. Praying alone would be sufficient for man to feel a connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I failed to mention earlier that this year is dedicated in memory of Moshe ben Sana, Mr. Borg. I mentioned that Mr. Borg was a very special person. I mentioned just recently it was his wife's yard site, and this week is his yard site. He was a very special person that he taught others by his personality, not by what he told people. And we're talking here about going from one stage of history into another stage of history. That man goes, when you go from one situation to another situation, you face all kinds of challenges. So Mr. Borg was a person who brought, in a sense, the psychology of the Jew of Europe, the whole approach of the Jew of Europe. He helped bring it to America. And this week that it's his yard site, he's a person that we constantly remember. There are people who, after they pass away, after time, you don't constantly think about them. But Mr. Borg, he was a member of my shul. He was a person is a person who you don't forget. And what was special about him is that he was always very quiet, but nevertheless, in his quietness, he made an impression on everybody that cannot be forgotten. Okay, now so at the time of Noach, man had not yet progressed, and certainly there was up till the time of Noach. You see that everything that was bad, people did, and so consequently, man did not progress to the level. And more than that, they used these tendencies for idolatry, and it became identified with idolatry. So because of that, it was necessary for the Torah. It was necessary for the Torah to create the mitzvah of Korbanos to keep man away from idolatry. And we could perhaps suggest that the reason man didn't progress from the idolatry, did not progress from reaching a higher level of service, was because he adopted idolatry. To a certain degree, the idolatry held back his progress of the idea of service. And as a result of the idolatry, man could not raise himself to a higher level. Even people who perhaps recognize God. So because of this, it was necessary for the Torah to provide in a sense, the idolatry kept man back, and that kept this tendency, this need for Korbanos, for making sacrifices, and that would have kept man together with idolatry. It's idolatry that held men back, and then that held man from progressing from the state of Korbanos, and then it was Korbanos that would keep man into idolatry. Now, okay, but this perhaps could explain even through the time of Noah. But when we deal with Avram, we deal with Yitzchak, we deal with Yaakov, one has to wonder, why was it necessary for them to give Korbanos? Avram, as soon as he comes into Eretz Yisrael, he makes 3 mizbechos, 3 altars. Then ultimately, you have the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak on an altar. How are we to understand? How are we to understand this in view of the Rambam's opinion? There's certainly no one who would suggest that the Yavos would be enticed to idolatry because of Korbanos. So why did Abraham have to build an altar? Why did Yitzchak and Yaakov give Korbanos? But we could suggest a number of answers to that question. One is that Avram, the Avos, we say the Avos observed the whole Torah. And in a sense, we can view that from the perspective, Ma'aseh Avos Siman Labanim. The deeds of the Avos are a sign to the descendants of the Avos, to Klal Yisrael, of future generations, to the Jewish people who came later, how to act in different situations. What is the idea? The idea is that an Av, a father, teaches his children by example. Why does the Torah tell us so much about the Avos, about the patriarchs? I mentioned before the idea that patriarchs serve as an example for future generations. So if the Avos had to give Korbanos, if the Avos felt the need to give sacrifices to God, it wasn't because they had that need, but it's because of the future generations that they had to do it. And it's very interesting that the Torah, when the Avos do give Korbanos, when Avram gave Korbanos, so the Torah tells us, when did he build the Mizbechos? When God told him about future generations. So when he was told about future generations, so that's when he built the altar, presumably to give Korbanos. Because in that sense, he recognized that he is going to be the example for future generations. He wasn't living by himself. He wasn't even living with the people of his generation. but he was living with the future generations of the Jewish people. And they would have the need for Korbanos because of their exposure to idolatry in Egypt. And also, we could also say, because it's well known, especially in regard to Avram, that Avram, the Rambam in Hilchos Avodah Zarah says that he went from place to place, from town to town, and he would speak publicly for people to leave the idolatry. He tried to wean the people away from idolatry. And he tried to wean the people away from idolatry. So he recognized he had not only a mission because of future generations, he had a mission for his own generation. And he recognized that he couldn't wean them away from idolatry unless Korbanos were directed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, unless sacrifices were directed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. Vayikra b'shem Hashem, according to many Mefarshim, Vayikra b'shem Hashem means he called out in the name of God to the people of the other generations. So when he called out the name of God, when he made the Mizbeach, when he made the altar, so it was, he dedicated himself to the idea of weaning the mankind that he came in contact with from idolatry. Matter of fact, one of the sacrifices, it's made in Mamre, and Mamre, who was Mamre? Mamre was a person, Rashi tells us, who gave up Avodah Zarah near Hebron, and he wanted to strengthen. Avram wanted to strengthen those who are giving up Avodah Zarah, that they shouldn't have to face the challenge of their previous tendencies to give Korbanos to the Avodah Zarah. Consequently, Avram understood, and perhaps Baruch HaKodesh, that there was a need for Korbanos. There was a need for sacrifices in order to serve as an example for future generations, but also in order to teach the people of his generation. So that we can explain that was the reason why Avram gave Korbanos. But of course, the Korbanos, the Rambam doesn't mean to say that the Korbanos doesn't serve, and this has been pointed out by many of the Rishonim. The Rambam doesn't mean to say that Korbanos didn't serve a purpose in itself of connecting man with God. Of course, the Korbanos served an example of connecting man with God. But the Korbanos was necessary. It was used as a form of connecting man with God, because otherwise man would have been separated from God. But the Korbanos themselves created a connection. It wasn't just an act in itself that really served no purpose. So we could suggest that that's the reason why Avram, not so much because he had the need for Korbanos, it's because the people of his generation and the future generations had a need for Korbanos. want to suggest, however, and then there's another question that has to be asked. And that's the question of the relevancy of Korbanos in our time. There are those who suggest that this was the argument that was mentioned by the founders of the Reform movement, who, of course, separated themselves, distanced themselves from anything to do with Korbanos. They distanced themselves from the idea of a Jewish homeland in the state of Israel, in Eretz Yisrael. They distanced themselves from the whole idea of a Beis HaMikdash, where Korbanos was given, which they felt was an ancient form of worship. And some of them even had the chutzpah to use the Rambam as their source, ignoring the fact that the Rambam constantly talks about the restoration of Korbanos when Mashiach comes. All of a sudden, today, we see that the Beis HaMikdash, the Temple Mount, that was identified with a practice that many of them considered barbaric originally. For them, it's important all of a sudden to have forms of worship that are not in accordance with the halacha, with the tradition. They themselves rejected it. One must wonder, is it so? Why the change in their mind? What does the Beis HaMikdash mean to them if they reject Korbanos? Did that matter? They were the ones who proclaimed that Berlin was their Jerusalem. Why are they identifying with a form of worship that they abhor and look against? When they took away Tfilas Musaf, eliminating the davening of Musaf, because it focuses on Korbanos, it focuses on sacrifices. Is it only to make trouble for the Orthodox Jews, from whom the Beis HaMikdash is a place that they look forward to for the return of Korbanos, for the return of the service of generations? Now, I want to suggest that another approach to the Rambam, and that is, we have to understand the main form of Korbanos was animal sacrifices. It's true, we have all kinds of menachos, but the main form of service on the Mizbeach was animal sacrifices. And in a sense, the Rambam considers animal sacrifices as being an inferior sacrifice, as being an inferior form of service. And it seems to me that we could suggest that why was animal sacrifices considered an inferior form of services? And from the Rambam, it appears that if not for the problem of the impact of that idolatry had on the Jewish people, there wouldn't have been a need for Korbanos. Not that Korbanos doesn't serve a purpose of creating a linkage with God. It certainly does. But that linkage would have been created in another manner. What is it about Korbanos? I think we could suggest, because Korbanos, when people give Korbanos, give sacrifices, there is the possibility that Korbanos will be seen as feeding God, as giving food to God, in a sense that we are identifying God, chas v'shalom, with the way we are. We are hungry. We eat and we become satisfied. So those who give korbanos, who give sacrifices, could chas v'shalom have that same perspective, that God is hungry, chas v'shalom, and that we are feeding him with the sacrifices. And that was probably the perspective. Of course, that was not the original perspective of Korbanos, but the idolatrous groups associated Korbanos with that perspective. Now, we could suggest that the danger of Korbanos was only when man was allowed to eat meat. But before man was allowed to eat meat, there wasn't such a great danger in people having that perspective. There wasn't such a great danger that people will have that perspective that they're feeding God. In a sense, it gave a physical, that perspective gives God almost physical features, chas v'shalom. And that's why perhaps that the Korbanos became an inferior form of worship. But until that time when man was allowed to eat Korbanos, it was unlikely to eat meat, until the time, because initially man was not allowed to eat meat till after the flood. So until after the flood, one did not see the giving of animal sacrifice as feeding God, because man himself did not eat meat or was not allowed to eat meat. And at what point did that change? That changed after Noah's korban. So up till the time after Noah's korban, immediately after Noah's korban, man was given the permission to eat meat. Since man was given the permission to eat meat, so at that point, there was a concern about how Korbanos will be viewed. And we could say, so the whole problem, the whole problem with Korbanos begins after Noah's korban, after Noah's sacrifice. But then the question is, what about the Avos? What about Avram? Avram made 3 mizbechos, 3 altars. And those 3 altars, so why at that point, there should have been that fear that will lead to this perspective of Chas v'Shalom feeding HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So how are we to understand it? But I think the way we could understand it is the following. My uncle, not in regard to the Rambam, not in regard to this, he says, if you take a look about the mizbechos that Avram made, the altars that Avram built, it doesn't say that he gave korbanos on those altars. He just built altars. Doesn't mention that he actually gave korbanos on them. So what was the idea of creating the altar? Because Avram, in a sense, because the nations of the world saw korban, the Mizbeach, as a means of giving something to God. Avram saw the altar. He, in a sense, theoretically put himself on the altar. He said the korban, what we're giving God is not the animal sacrifice, chas v'shalom. What we're giving God is ourselves. And when the Korbanos were given earlier, when Hevel gave a korban earlier, it was only a symbol of giving over of oneself. So, but as a result of the danger associated with Korbanos after the time of Noah, Avram felt we cannot give animal sacrifices because that would misrepresent the whole idea of Korbanos. So there won't be an animal sacrifice. It will be just me. I'm giving myself over to God. It was symbolic. Those were the three, but eventually it became necessary to restore the animal sacrifice. So Avram put Yitzchak, he got the command from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to put Yitzchak on the altar and to put a ram in place of Yitzchak. In other words, we should see that the animal sacrifice is in place of ourselves. I always mention the Alshich. The Alshich says, what was the difference between the korban, between the sacrifice of Cain and the sacrifice of Hevel? The Alshich says, the Torah says, the Hevel hevi gam hu meibchor sono. Hevel not only brought the animal sacrifice, but gam hu, he brought himself with it. And as the first pasuk in Vayikra says, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban laHashem, as the Baal Tanya in L'Kutei Torah says, that yes, you give me an etzonim in a bakar, but it has to be mikem. Yeah, it has to be combined from giving from yourself also. It's not just the external korban, it's the internal korban as well. And I always mention that at the time of the dedication of the Mishkan, so each of the Nesiim gave a korban. And they all gave the same korban, the same sacrifice. And the Torah repeats each one sacrificed separately. Question is, why didn't the Torah just say that why did the Torah just tell us what the sacrifice was and tell us on the first day the carbon was given by Nachshon ben Aminadav, the Nasi? It doesn't mention Nasi there, but the Nasi of Shevet Yehuda. And on the second day, Nisanel ben Sur, who was the Nasi of Shevet Yisachar, and so on and so forth. Why do you have to repeat all the ingredients of the sacrifice 12 times? And the answer is because the Nisim, when they gave the sacrifice, they gave themselves over also. And each person is different. So to show that each sacrifice that they gave themselves over, so the Torah writes it as if each sacrifice was different. Because the idea of sacrifice is to come when we give the sacrifice, but we have to give ourselves over with the sacrifice as well. And this is the idea of carbon, coming close to God. So we're giving ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. Now what was so we could suggest that the Avos, until the time of the Akedah, they just gave themselves over. There was, as my uncle says, there was no animal carbon. At what point but once Yitzchak, the Akedah takes place, the purpose of the Akedah is for the idea of the animal sacrifice being in place of the person. And why was that necessary? Because what does the transfer, in a sense, that represents the end of the leadership, the joint leadership of Avram and Sarah. It represents, in a sense, the transfer of the end of the generation of Avram and Sarah going into the generation of Yitzchak. Yitzchak represents future generations. Yitzchak himself had no need, perhaps, for the animal sacrifices. But at that point, there's a special focus, we could say, that at that point, as the transfer takes place, a focus begins about future generations. And for future generations, it was important because of the reasons that the Rambam says that to have animal sacrifices. So this is the way we could explain the Rambam. Now, the question is, today, what is the relevancy of Korbanos today? The Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah is not there anymore. I want to suggest there are a number of possible answers. One answer I heard from my father, Zatzal. My father said, it could be that there is no drive for Korbanos, but there is a drive for the irrational. People do all kinds of strange things. People they're scared on certain days of the year. I don't even want to mention. Of course, it's prohibited. People have a drive for the irrational, and especially, and a person can be driven to all kinds of cults and all kinds of group because of because there is some drive for the irrational. Man has a tendency, yes, we like to be rational, but there are times when we feel driven by the irrational. And the drive for the irrational could lead a man astray. So, in a sense, the Korbanos fulfill that need, that need that man has for the irrational. But there is another. We could suggest that could be today from the psychological perspective, there might not be a need for Korbanos. First of all, I think it is, since there was Korbanos in the past, the Korbanos gives us this ability of feeling close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Since it was necessary for our ancestors, it becomes necessary for us. So it does serve that psychological need, especially somebody who sinned. And the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, when he talks, why is there a mitzvah of tshuva? He says, because if a person is identified, remains identified with his sin, he will never give up sin. In order for a person to return to the proper path, he has to be able to see himself, that he became closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he became closer to God. And the Korbanos, in a sense, weaned the Jew from Avodah Zarah. And it gave him a sense I can be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why it's kapara. So in a sense, we still have that need to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We might not be enticed by the couple of Avodah Zarah movements that there are. But if we don't feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is a possibility, not a possibility, it's almost for sure we will sin in many areas. And the Korbanos, the Karev, come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Korbanos gives us that sense of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I want to take this along the lines. We're approaching Pesach, we're approaching Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So in the Haggadah we say, M'tchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avosei. And it's really psukim from Yehoshua. And the question is, what does it say? M'tchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avosei. It should say b'tchila hayu ovdei avodah zarah avosei. But the answer, I think, is, and in a sense, the question is, we talk about the Arba Banim, the 4 sons. So, in a sense, the M'tchila of the Avodah Zarah, how you have a seinu, the way the Haggadah is formulated, in a sense, tells us, I think, is a word of encouragement to the father of the Ben Rasha, of the rebellious son, the son who perhaps has to get the message of silence. And in one hand we say, Ve'emor lo, you tell him. And then you say, leave alo lo. Doesn't say, leave alo lecha. In other words, sometimes the best message is a message of silence. To a certain degree, the Ben Rasha is an Enio de Elisho. Pesach is a holiday, as I mentioned before, Pesach is a holiday of communication. And when you have the Sheni Yadili show, it's not Psachlo. With the Ben Rasha, a person can talk, cannot communicate. The Ben Rasha is not interested in communication. He just wants to make statements. So you don't engage him in his stupid debates. We have to explain, we have to teach. But we can't engage in stupid debates. So, you have to tell him. but don't engage him. Leave a low. He has to see. He will be influenced by the way you act, not by engaging him in debates. And there's another thing. He shouldn't think that he has an influence on you. In the beginning of Chumash Bereshis, the Torah tells us, why does the Torah start off with Bereshis Bara Elokim? As the Shemayim Besaretz, the Torah should start off with Chodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. The first mitzvah of the Torah is a book of mitzvos. Shem Yomru Umos Olam Listam Atem, the nations of the world will say that you took land that didn't belong to you. Hevei Omer Lahem, you tell them. They're going to listen to us. In other words, you just make it very clear. The way you make it clear with the Ben Russia is by showing that he has no influence on you, and you will not engage him in stupid debates. And that's the same thing by Paradum, by Chuzos Chukas Torah, Dumas Olam, the nations of the world, Monin as Yisrael, trying to torture us. And when we hear it time and time again, we begin to perhaps have doubts. Zos Chukas Torah, this is the command of the Torah. We cannot let them think that we're interested in their stupid debates. If you're willing to talk, if you're willing to learn, that's one thing. But if you're just willing to talk, that's not communication. When we say Pesach, the Zohar says Pesach, a talking mouth. It's not just talking, it's communicating. The word Vayikra is to communicate. The Rambam points out that when it comes to Bikurim, Higarati Hayom El Hashem Elokai, I communicated to my God. These were the first words you said. How can you say Higarati Hayom? But I communicated to God when I marched in with the Bikurim, the Rambam says. So Pesach is a holiday of that I communicate. People communicate, not by words alone. On the contrary, sometimes words is not communication. It's the very opposite of communication. You don't let them negate understanding or being involved in learning by their verbiage. Learning has to be through communication. You don't have to engage in debates. But by the Ben Russia, by the Ben Russia, we say, but we have to know that there's always hope. There's always hope, and we have to be ready to help when the opportunity presents itself. But if you always give in, the opportunity doesn't present itself. And this is when we say, in other words, it wasn't just it wasn't just Avram in the early part of his life, but future generations also were Ovdei Avodah Zarah. But v'yachshav kervanu hamakam lavodaso, Avram, HaKadosh Baruch Hu always brings us close to Him. He gives us the opportunity to be close to Him. He tries to create circumstances that we should want to be close to Him. It doesn't mean He brought us close to Mount Sinai. He brought us close to him. He revealed himself to him. And in a sense, when people look at the world, when people see how you act, and I mentioned that the shir today was in memory of Mr. Borg, who was a man that didn't talk, at least in shul, whatever. But everybody was impressed with him because of the way he acted. It wasn't oralization. It was demonstration, not purpose demonstration, just the way he was. And I want to say that, so in a sense, the giving of Korbanos, in a sense, we could say that represents the Jews' transition from Avodah Zarah to Avodas Hashem. So we have to do what our ancestors did, because that offers us hope of Achshav Kevanu Hamakum Avodaso. The korban is the symbol of Avodah, but the biggest what prevents the Avodah, what prevents our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the fact that we know we sin. And we feel identified with that sin. It hangs over us. So we take that animal sacrifice that shows the transition from idolatry into Avodas Hashem, into the service of God. And that's why it's a kapara. And so that's why it's an atonement. It's the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the giving of Korbanos reminds us of our past and how our ancestors were able to change their pattern of life. And it gives us hope that we will be able to change our pattern of life and become more fully devoted to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to his service. Okay.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. This is from a long time ago, but early in the share. What was the reason for Korbanos having to do with fire?
The Rambam, because most of the time that's how Korbanos. There were individual Korbanos that didn't have to do with fire, but the Rambam seems to say in the Moreh Nevuchim that the drive was for Korbanos with fire. Maybe it's just the way most Korbanos was, but in the Moreh Nevuchim he mentions Korbanos with fire.
Okay.
And in Kabbalah they say that the fire represents mimata l'mayla. It's in a sense heading upward. That's